Little Somachi stood barefoot between moving cars in heavy Lagos traffic, balancing a tray of groundnuts on her head while shouting for customers through the noise of Danfo buses and blaring horns. Sweat rolled down her small face as she hurried from one car to another until a woman inside a black Jeep suddenly grabbed her hand and screamed, "Thief!" Within seconds, people gathered around the traffic light. Some insulted her, others threatened to drag her to the police station. Somachi was already crying when Mama Ngozi pushed through the crowd, pulled her daughter behind her, and said the words her children had heard their entire lives. "A lie can feed you today, but it will destroy you tomorrow." People laughed at the old woman and drove away, but years later, on one terrible night inside a crowded city apartment, when police officers stood at their door and one secret threatened to destroy the entire family, it was that same truth Mama Ngozi preached all her life that returned to save her. Lagos does not sleep, it only shifts. During the day, it is horns and shouting and the smell of suya smoke drifting over gutters clogged with black water. At night, it becomes generators humming behind zinc fences, television noise bleeding through thin walls, and the distant wailing of sirens that nobody stops to investigate because city people learn quickly that other people's emergencies are never their own. Mama Ngozi had lived inside Block C of Femi Adeyemi compound on Ogungi Street for 11 years. The compound held 6 apartments and approximately 42 people, depending on which family had a visitor sleeping over, which was nearly always. The walls between rooms were thin enough that arguments became entertainment and laughter became community property. Privacy was something that belonged to people in the bigger estates, the ones with gatemen and security cameras and cars that sat in garages like sleeping animals. Here, everything was shared, including shame. She had buried her husband, Emmanuel, 9 years earlier after a short illness that the family still described as a sickness that came too fast and stayed too long. He left her with 3 children, a rented room that had since expanded into 2 through careful negotiation with the landlord, and the same lesson he himself had repeated through their 22 years of marriage. A person's name is the only thing that outlives them, so guard it like money because it spends the same way. Mama Ngozi carried that lesson like a wrapper tied tightly around her waist. It never loosened, even when the vegetable market brought in so little that supper was plain yam and palm oil. Even when the landlord knocked in December with his face already set for argument. Even when the city swallowed whole families around her and spat them out, changed quieter, harder, their eyes carrying something dim where brightness used to live. She would pull her children close on such nights, the 3 of them arranging themselves around her on the mat the way they did when they were small, and she would say it again, not loudly, not like a preacher performing for attendance. She said it the way someone passes a cup of water to a person who does not yet know they are thirsty. A lie can feed you today, but it will destroy you tomorrow. Chinedu, her eldest, stopped hearing it somewhere around his 26th year. By then, he had a wife named Emeka and a son named Emmanuel after his late father, and a job at a mid-sized finance firm in Victoria Island that required him to take 2 buses and a keke every morning and still arrive before 8 o'clock, or risk a query from the kind of manager who checked attendance like a prayer to his own importance. He was 31 now, and the job paid a salary that covered his share of rent and school fees and nothing else convincingly. He watched his colleagues arrive in their own cars. He watched them eat at restaurants he had only entered once to use the bathroom. He watched the world arrange itself into people who had crossed some invisible line and people who were still approaching it, and he could not see any more what honest work was doing to help him cross. This was the tension Mama Ngozi sensed, first in his silences at the dinner table, then in the defensiveness that rose quickly in him whenever she asked simple questions. Then in the new phone he brought home one Tuesday, not the cheap kind that cracked at the corners after 3 months, but the kind that came in a proper white box, with a charging cord coiled neatly inside like something precious. She had not accused him. That was not her way. But she had looked at that phone the way a woman who has carried a family alone for 9 years looks at anything that arrives without explanation, with the quiet, patient attention of someone who already knows that questions left unasked do not disappear. They only wait. Amaka had noticed longer before Mama Ngozi did what was changing in her husband, because wives always know first. It lives in small things, a shift in the timing of his phone pickups, conversations that pause when she enters a room, a softness in his explanations that was not there before. She did not push him. Amaka was the kind of woman who grew up watching her own parents tear their home apart arguing, so she had decided early that silence was kinder than conflict. She kept the peace the way some people keep a wound covered, managed, never quite healed. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself that Chinedu was simply tired of struggling, that every man hit a wall eventually and looked for ways around it. She told herself that she would wait. Kelechi, the youngest son, was 23 and building himself out of borrowed confidence. He wore loud shirts and laughed easily and moved through the compound with the loose energy of a young man who had not yet been truly hurt by anything. But his friends were the kind that Lagos produces in frightening numbers, young, hungry, clever with devices, and desperate enough to use that cleverness in directions that did not require patience. They had names like bio and show and double, and they existed in spaces between things, between 9 to 5 and real money, between clever and criminal, between the kind of boy a mother prays for and the kind she prays about. Kelechi had started telling small lies when he was 16. By 23, the lies had grown legs and schedules. He lied about where he spent Tuesday nights. He lied about the source of the money he occasionally brought home with the casual performance of a man who wants credit without questions. He borrowed from Mama Tunde in apartment 4 with promises he stretched over months. He was not a bad person in the way that hardened people are bad. He was a frightened person pretending loudly not to be afraid. Sumachi was 20 years old and had not forgotten the woman in the black jeep. She thought about her sometimes, not with bitterness exactly, but with the kind of clarity that certain humiliations carve into a person permanently. She had been 9 years old, barefoot, honest, working, and still the accusation had come as if honesty was invisible, as if the visible poverty was the only thing anyone could see. She had cried that afternoon not only because of the fear and the crowd and the insults. She had cried because she understood, even at 9, that the world was not arranged to look kindly on people who looked like her. But Mama Ngozi had come. She had pushed through the crowd and pulled her daughter behind her and said the words with such absolute certainty that the crowd had not known whether to mock the lesson or feel ashamed of needing to hear it. Sumachi held that certainty the way she held everything her mother gave her carefully, knowing that some things break if you grip too hard, but are lost if you let go. She studied whenever she could. During the day, she helped her mother arrange vegetables at the junction stall, calling prices, making change, watching the city from her mother's side. At night, she spread her books on the small table beside the window that looked out over the compound yard, working through nursing textbooks by the yellow light of a rechargeable lantern, memorizing dosages and anatomy while generators coughed outside and neighbours argued over noise she had learned to read as white sound. She wanted to become a nurse with the specific, grounded desire of someone who has seen enough suffering up close to understand that caring for people is not a soft ambition. It is a hard one. It requires precision and steadiness and the capacity to remain calm in rooms that contain fear. She believed she had those things. Mama Ngozi believed she had them too. The money disappearance happened in March. The compound operated a monthly contribution fund that all 6 households paid into a collective account that covered small repairs, covered a family in emergency, or accumulated toward larger needs. The landlord, Alhaji Bello, managed it with his usual combination of authority and mild suspicion of everyone equally. When he announced that 2 months' contribution had gone missing from the envelope kept inside his inner sitting room, the compound responded the way tight communities always do when something valuable disappears with immediate, comprehensive suspicion of whoever had changed most recently. Chinedu had changed most recently. The whispers started at the borehole where women gathered to fill buckets in the mornings. By evening, they had spread to the corridors. By the following day, they had the texture of established fact, even though nobody had spoken anything aloud to Chinedu's face. Mama Tunde sucked her teeth in ways that carried commentary. Oga Sunday from apartment 2 had stopped greeting Emeka with his usual warmth. Children playing in the compound yard had absorbed the tension without understanding it and shouted at each other in ways that somehow included Chinedu's name. Mama Ngozi heard all of it. She did not confront Chinedu immediately. Instead, she prayed. Then she watched. Then one evening, while Emeka was visiting her mother and the apartment was quiet, she sat beside her son and asked him simply, "Chinedu, is your head clean?" He looked at her. She had the kind of eyes that had always made dishonesty uncomfortable, not cruel eyes, not the eyes of someone hunting for reasons to judge. Just eyes that had seen enough to recognize the weight of a thing carried secretly, eyes that had been looking at him his whole life. "Mama, I'm not a thief," he said. "I did not ask if you were a thief. I asked if your head is clean." He held her gaze for 3 seconds longer than he should have, then looked away. "I'm trying to take care of my family." She said nothing more that evening. But her silence was not the silence of someone who had finished thinking. The rain came early that April. It arrived with the particular violence of Lagos rain, not gradually, not with the polite announcement of thunder building slowly somewhere far off, but suddenly, completely, as if the sky had been saving something and decided all at once to spend it. Within minutes, the compound yard flooded. Water ran under doors. Children were called inside from games. The generators went quiet, one by one, as people covered them with plastic sheeting and retreated. It was inside this rain, in the flickering corridor light of Block C, that the police arrived. There were 3 of them, 2 uniformed, 1 in plain clothes. They knocked with the particular authority of people who have not come to ask permission. Emeka opened the door, and the sound she made when she saw them was not quite a scream. It was the kind of involuntary breath a person releases when something they feared privately materializes publicly and the body registers the confirmation before the mind does. The plain-clothed officer asked for Chinedu by his full name, Chinedu Obiora. Within 4 minutes, the corridor was full. Neighbours appeared with the speed that trouble always generates in compound living. Mama Tunde held a wrapper around her shoulders and watched with the expression of someone whose suspicion has been rewarded. Oga Sunday stood with his arms crossed. 3 children sat on the staircase and were not removed because their parents were too absorbed to remember them. Alhaji Bello arrived last, taking his position near the door of his own apartment, with the authority of a man on whose property something significant was occurring. Chinedu came out of the bedroom buttoning his shirt with hands that were visibly unsteady. He looked at the officers and then, briefly, at his mother. Mama Nosy had risen from her mat. She stood small and straight in her sleeping wrapper, her grey-streaked hair loose around her face, and she looked at her son with an expression that nobody in that corridor could fully read because it contained too many things at once, fear and grief, and the exhausted love of a woman who had warned and warned and warned. The officer explained in the flat language of official process that Chinedu was being invited to answer questions regarding irregular fund transfers flagged in accounts connected to his office. A senior manager had been flagged for financial irregularities. Several junior account officers had processed transactions that were now under investigation. "I didn't do anything," Chinedu said. The words came out brittle. "You will have opportunity to explain at the station," the officer replied. Emeka broke then. The sound of her crying cut through the rain and the murmuring neighbours with such rawness that even Mama Tunde's expression shifted slightly towards something more human. Little Emmanuel, 3 years old, and frightened by his mother's tears, began crying too, reaching up with both arms from the floor. Kelechi was not there. He had come home earlier, eaten quickly, and gone back out as he often did on evenings when his other life required him. Nobody knew where he was. Nobody had thought to wonder until this moment when his absence felt like its own kind of statement. Mama Ngozi moved through the corridor. She touched Emeka's shoulder. She picked up Emmanuel and held him against her chest, where the child quieted slightly, confused by the way crying could sometimes be comforted by more crying that was steadier than his own. She looked at the officers. "My son will go with you," she said. "Quietly, clearly. He will answer your questions honestly, because that is what we do." The neighbour crowd parted for them as Chinedu left with the officers into the rain-dark street. The compound watched. Some faces held satisfaction, some held unease. Some fewer, but present, held something closer to sorrow for a family they had known for 11 years and were not certain what to make of tonight. When the door closed, Mama Ngozi stood in the corridor with Emmanuel on her hip and looked at no one in particular and said nothing at all. The rain continued. It was Somachi who moved first. She went to the bedroom she shared with her mother, reached beneath the mattress where her nursing textbooks were stacked, and removed a thin brown envelope that had been sitting there for 6 weeks. She had found the documents in January. She had been looking for a pen in Chinedu's room while he and Emeka were out a small, ordinary errand of the kind that happens in apartments where space is shared and ownership of objects is flexible. The documents had been folded inside a shirt in the bottom drawer. She had not meant to read them. But the header of the first page contained a familiar company name, and her eyes had moved across the first paragraph with the automatic comprehension of someone who reads quickly by habit, and within seconds she understood that she was holding something important. The documents were internal transfer authorizations. Several of them bore Chinedu's name as processing officer. But the instructions column, which specified the originating authority for each transfer, carried a single name repeatedly. M.O. Okafor, Senior Manager, Treasury Operations. She had sat on Chinedu's floor for a long time holding those pages. She thought about confronting him. She imagined how the conversation would go, his defensiveness, his anger, perhaps his shame, perhaps the look of a man who knew he had moved too close to something dangerous and did not know how to step back. She thought about telling Mama Ngozi. She thought about what her mother had always said about truth needing to leave footprints. If this comes apart, she had thought, there needs to be proof that he didn't start it. She had made copies at the business centre 2 streets away, paying from her lantern recharge money, and stored them in the brown envelope under her mattress. Then she had waited. She had told herself she was waiting for the right moment. In truth, she had been waiting to see if the danger was real or if she had misread what she found. By April, with the whispers in the compound and Chinedu's increasing distance and Emeka's increasingly hollow eyes, she had understood that the danger was real. She had simply not expected it to arrive in a rainstorm with 3 police officers. Now she brought the envelope to her mother. Mama Ngozi looked at it for a moment without opening it. She looked at her daughter's face, young, steady, slightly pale, with the particular tension of someone who has been carrying something alone and is finally setting it down. "How long?" Mama Ngozi asked. "January," Somachi said. Her mother opened the envelope. She reviewed the documents slowly, turning each page with the deliberate care of someone who did not want to miss anything. The rain outside had settled into a steadier rhythm. Emmanuel had fallen asleep on the mat. Emeka sat against the wall with her knees drawn up, watching Mama Ngozi's face for information. When Mama Ngozi finished, she refolded the pages carefully and looked at Somachi. "You kept these. You always said truth must leave footprints." The old woman was quiet for a long time. Then she pressed her palm flat against her daughter's cheek, not gently, not sentimentally, but with the firm pressure of someone confirming that something real is present. She held it there for 3 seconds. "God is not sleeping," she said softly. Then she stood and began dressing to go to the police station. It was nearly midnight when Kelechi came home. He came through the compound gate, hunched and limping slightly, his shirt torn at the shoulder, and his face carrying the particular expression of a young man who has been forcibly educated. The corridor light caught him as he climbed the steps, the split lip, the swollen eye, the way he flinched at a sound from the generator next door that was simply a generator and nothing more. Bayo had disappeared with everything. The scheme that Double had been running, redirecting payments through fake vendor accounts. harvesting card details from desperate job seekers who paid for applications that led nowhere, had finally attracted attention from the right kind of dangerous people. And when the collapse came, it came fast and complete and violent. Sho had been arrested. Double had run. Bio had taken what was left and sent a single message that contained only a number and no explanation. Kelechi stood in the corridor of his family's apartment and understood that he was 23 years old and had spent the last 2 years building something that had just destroyed itself and nearly him with it. He pushed open the door. Mama Ngozi was there. She had not gone to the station, yet a call from Chinedu's colleague had confirmed the documents were being sent digitally ahead of their arrival, buying time, buying him the hours needed for the right people to see what the evidence said. She sat in the main room with Emeka and Samachi around her, the lantern casting its yellow light over their faces. She looked at her son, his torn shirt, his bruised face, the particular emptiness in his eyes that she recognized as the expression of someone who has lost an argument with the version of themselves they were becoming. He opened his mouth. "Mama, sit down," she said. Not harshly, but in the voice she used when she was holding something carefully. He sat on the floor. He looked at his hands for a moment. Then he looked at her, and the story came out of him in the broken, stumbling way that truth emerges from people who have been lying for a long time, not smoothly, not in order, but in pieces, with gaps and doubling back, and moments where his voice cracked and went quiet. He told her about Bio and Double. He told her about the vendor accounts and the card harvesting. He told her about the borrowed money from Mama Tunde. He told her about every small lie layered over every other small lie, until the thing he had built was not a life, but a structure of sustained deception that had now fallen on him. When he finished, the room was quiet, except for the rain. Mama Ngozi looked at him for a long time. He could not read her face clearly. It held too many things he had spent his life learning to read separately and had never seen together in one expression before. "The money from Mama Tunde," she said finally. "Do you know how much exactly?" 14,000. Maybe 15. She nodded slowly. "We will return it. Every naira." "Mama, I don't." "We will return it," she said again. Same quiet, same absolute certainty that had stopped crowds at traffic lights. "Not because you will not suffer consequences, you will, but because we do not carry other people's money in this family. We never have." Emeka was crying again quietly this time, with her face turned toward the wall. Somachi looked at her brother with an expression that was not contempt and not pity. It was the look of someone who had made different choices in the same difficult circumstances and understood that the difference was not talent or luck, but a decision made small and daily to hold one thing steady. Kelechi lowered his head and wept. It was the first honest thing he had done in 2 years. The investigation took 5 weeks. The documents Samachi had preserved confirmed what internal audits eventually established. M.O. Okafor had been systematically routing unauthorized transfers through junior officers' accounts for 18 months, exploiting the trust that organizational hierarchy creates, distributing the footprint of his crimes across people too junior to audit closely and too frightened to ask the questions their signatures required them to understand. Chinedu had processed transactions he did not fully understand, trusting a manager's verbal assurances that the paperwork was routine. It was not a full exoneration. He had been careless in the specific way that wanting something better makes people careless. He had not asked the questions he should have asked, because asking them might have closed doors he was hoping to walk through. The main charges were not filed against him. M.O. Okafor was arrested. Chinedu was formally cautioned and lost his position. The firm did not contest the dismissal appeal generously. He came home on a Thursday afternoon to an apartment that held his mother, his wife, his son, and his sister. He sat down at the table and no one spoke immediately. Emeka put food in front of him, the ordinary food of their ordinary life, yam and egusi soup cooked with the careful economy of someone stretching ingredients to their full distance. He ate it. He did not perform gratitude or shame or resolution. He simply ate. And somewhere inside the eating was a man beginning to understand what his mother had been trying to tell him, not about poverty, but about the specific danger of letting the desire to escape poverty determine what you are willing to become. After dinner, Mama Ngozi sat beside him. "Your father was poor his whole life," she said. "But when he died, 7 men who had borrowed money from him and paid it back came to his funeral without being called. They came because he had treated them honestly, and they needed to stand somewhere when he was gone." Chinedu said nothing. "That is not nothing," she said. "That is not a small thing." He looked at his hands on the table. "I know, Mama." "Know it differently now," she said. "Know it in your chest." Kelechi went to Mama Tunde the following Monday. He knocked on her door in the morning and stood in the compound yard holding a white envelope and a face that had not yet fully learned the posture of humility but was attempting it with visible effort. Mama Tunde opened the door and looked at him with the precise expression of a woman who has been waiting for a particular conversation for several months. He held out the envelope. 15,000. I counted an extra 1,000 for the time it took. She took it, opened it, counted it. Then she looked at him for a long moment with her head tilted slightly. "Your mother raised you," she said finally. It was both an observation and a verdict. "Yes, Ma," he said. She nodded and closed the door. He stood in the compound yard for a moment, looking at the ground. Then he straightened his shirt and walked to the apartment of Malam Haruna, the electrical technician on the ground floor, and asked if he could learn. The technician looked him over with the evaluation of a man who has taught unwilling apprentices before and has developed good instincts about who will stay. "Come Monday," Malam Haruna said. 6 o'clock. Don't be late once." Kelechi came at 5:45. He was never late once. Somachi received her nursing school admission letter in May. She was sitting at the junction stall, helping her mother arrange tomatoes, when the text message arrived on the small phone her mother had saved months to buy her. She read it twice. Then she read it a third time, with her hands completely still on the tomatoes, because she did not want to move incorrectly and discover she had misread it. She had not misread it. The fees remained the problem. Admission was not arrival. She set the phone down and continued arranging tomatoes, and told herself that the problem was solvable because Mama Ngozi had taught her that solvable problems deserved calm, and only unsolvable ones deserved grief. 2 days later, the compound gathered without announcement. It had started with Oga Sunday, who had quietly spoken to 2 others, who had spoken to 2 more. Alhaji Bello contributed the largest portion and said little about it, which was more meaningful than whatever he might have said. Mama Tunde contributed and sent it with a note that said simply, "The girl has done well, Mrs." Okafor from apartment 6, who had nothing extra and gave anyway, folded her portion inside a piece of wrapper as if it were a gift. They brought it to Mama Ngozi's door on a Thursday evening, a collection, carefully counted, slightly more than the fees required. Mama Ngozi stood at the door receiving it and said nothing for a moment that was long enough to be noticed. Her eyes moved across the faces in the corridor, the same faces that had stood watching when the police came, the same mouths that had whispered, the same neighbours who laughed at her lessons and repeated them anyway. "Thank you," she said. It was insufficient for what she meant, but she had spent her life understanding that the most important things exceed language, and that the attempt to say them is what matters. Sumaki, standing behind her mother, pressed her face briefly into Mama Ngozi's shoulder. By June, something in the compound had shifted in the quiet way that important things shift, not announced, not displayed, but present in the texture of ordinary interactions. Mama Ngozi's expressions appeared on other people's faces when children were corrected in the yard. Her phrases were repeated with the casual, unconscious frequency of adopted wisdom. Even Alhaji Bello, a man not given to sentiment, was heard telling his nephew, who had arrived from Enugu with expensive habits and vague plans, that honesty was not a poverty strategy. It was a survival one. Different thing entirely. Mama Ngozi's health continued its slow argument with her age. Her knees ached on cold mornings. She tired more easily at the junction stall. Some days, Somachi managed the stall alone, while her mother rested inside, and on those days, Mama Ngozi could be found sitting in the main room with Emmanuel on her lap, telling him stories in the low, steady voice she had used on his father and his father's siblings. The stories always contained the same bones: someone who chose truth in a difficult moment, someone who suffered for it initially, someone who was eventually, not always immediately, protected by it. Emmanuel was 3 years old and absorbed the stories with the complete attention of children who do not yet know the difference between a lesson and entertainment. One evening in early July, while Lagos arranged itself into its end-of-day chaos, the traffic, the generators, the hawkers calling their goods into the orange dusk, Mama Ngozi sat beside her small junction stall and watched the road. Somachi was beside her, arranging the last vegetables before they packed up. Her nursing school orientation was 2 weeks away. She had already organized her things into a bag that she repacked every few days with a thoroughness that was not anxiety but preparation, the careful readiness of someone who has wanted something for a long time and is making sure she is ready when it arrives. They sat together in the particular companionable silence of a mother and daughter who have said the important things already and are now simply present with each other while traffic passes and the city does what the city does. A Danfo bus braked suddenly nearby, horn blaring, the conductor leaning out the door to shout something at a keke that had cut across his path. The noise was enormous and ordinary, and absorbed into the evening like everything else. A woman walked past balancing a tray of groundnuts on her head, calling her prices clearly above the sound of engines. Mama Ngozi watched the woman. Her face was quiet. Somachi followed her mother's gaze and understood what she was looking at, or rather, who she was remembering. The woman in the black jeep, the the crowd at the traffic light. A 9-year-old girl, barefoot, already crying. A mother pushing through. "Mama?" Somachi said. Do you ever regret it? Any of it, the way you taught us?" Mama Ngozi was quiet for a moment. A motorcycle wove between two buses. Somewhere a child called for its mother and was answered. "I regret your father didn't see you," she said finally. "He would have been proud in a way I don't have enough words for." She was quiet again. Then, "The rest, no, I don't regret the rest." She smiled softly. Not the large smile of performances or celebrations, but the small, private smile of a woman who has carried something heavy for a long time and arrived somewhere. Somachi looked at her mother's face. In the fading orange light, the grey hair, the tired eyes, the particular strength that age had not reduced but only made more specific, more clearly itself, and felt something move in her chest that she did not have a clinical name for and did not need one. She reached across and took her mother's hand. They sat like that while the traffic moved around them and the city continued its endless, indifferent, magnificent life, and the sky above Lagos faded from orange to deep purple to the first quiet dark. Because sometimes karma does not only punish people, sometimes it reveals which lessons were worth protecting all along. And the greatest wealth a parent can leave behind is not money, but the kind of truth that can still save a family long after life becomes difficult. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification, because we bring to you real-life stories that will inspire you. God bless you and see you in the next video. Please don't forget to subscribe. Thank you.